and welcome to another thrilling installment of Monetary Economics on NyQuil. For this episode, it's the demand for money on NyQuil, part 1. And then, part 2 comes later because that's how things work. Anyway, so aside from talking about NyQuil, there's an excellent recipe out there for NyQuil chicken, by the way, that I highly suggest you never check out. We talked about what money was, right? We talked about the functions, the purposes money had to serve in order to be called money. We talked about how the money supply was set, how the Federal Reserve used open market operations by purchasing these treasury securities via the creation of excess reserves. Thus, they are taking an illiquid asset and they are turning it into a very liquid asset, which is cash, right? Vault cash. So they are exchanging a liquid asset or an illiquid asset for a liquid asset. And that provides financial institutions with more liquidity. It lets them meet their short-term financial obligations a little bit more easily so they don't have to go and liquidate a bunch of stuff that then ends up being sold at a lower price. The economy loses value, all that stuff, right? We learned about that already. But what we didn't learn about yet was the demand for money. So let's talk about the demand for money this time in this lecture. All right, we can talk about how money demand is determined. We can also talk about how the equilibrium point between money demand and money supply determines the price level, how it determines interest rates, and what that implies for inflation. Now, we're going to be talking about two different models in the money demand lecture series. In part 1, we're talking about a model. In part 2, we're going to be talking about a different model. But we're going to be focusing primarily on a framework where money is neutral, right? Monetary neutrality. And what do I mean by monetary neutrality? Well, what I mean is that under the assumption of monetary neutrality, changes to the nominal stock of money or changes to the growth rate of money will have no effect on real economic variables in the long run. So if you were to change the money supply, that will be affecting the price level. That will affect nominal interest rates. But what it won't be affecting is something like unemployment. It won't be affecting the capital stock. It won't affect real GDP. Therefore, it won't affect real incomes. Right? Increasing the money supply won't be increasing production. So when money is neutral, really, there's a separation of sorts between nominal variables and real variables, but it's really only talking about the nominal variable that is money, right? Let's talk about some other nominal variables that can also be separated from real economic variables. Well, in that case, we need something that's known as the classical dichotomy. We'll be assuming that the classical dichotomy holds as well. Now, we can get into modifying the definition of monetary neutrality as well as the definition of the classical dichotomy in a little bit further on in the course. But for now, the definition of monetary neutrality is more than sufficient. And the definition of the classical dichotomy, which is that real and nominal variables can be analyzed separately when we're talking about long-run economic dynamics. Both of those are more than sufficient for the time being. Now, when we get into a slightly more advanced way of modeling macroeconomic dynamics, we can get into steady states. And when we discuss steady states, the concept of monetary neutrality as well as the classical dichotomy will be altered a little bit, and they'll be a little bit closer to what they actually mean in terms of thinking about this from like a more like advanced macro kind of research perspective. But at least in terms of just understanding this at like a base level, these two definitions are fine. And I probably went way, way overboard on time trying to say that. Now, one last little thing here on this page. These notes were heavily inspired by some lecture notes I found by this guy, Eric Sims. He is an excellent economic researcher. He's also, from what I can tell, an excellent economist when it comes to being able to actually teach this stuff, namely macroeconomics. He's actually got a really good textbook that's available for free online that is like intermediate macro. I've actually borrowed quite a bit from that. But he's got a couple of lectures on monetary economics, and this lecture video itself came very, very, very heavily from that. So I may not have any original ideas of my own, but at least I'm not a thief. So I guess there's that. Anyways, let's go on to the equation of exchange. That's what we're going to be discussing on this slide. The equation of exchange can be expressed as what we see in equation 1. M times V equals P times Y. So you're like, okay, great. What the hell is all that stuff? Well, Y is real output, right? So that's real GDP. You can also think of it as income, right? Because what is being produced is also income. So P is the dollar price of output. You can think of that as the price level. So P times Y, the price level, times real output is going to be giving us nominal GDP. And we can think of 1 over P as the quote-unquote price of money measured in terms of goods, which we'll be getting into a little bit later. V is the velocity of money. And we can think of this as the average number of times per year that the typical unit of money, capital M, is spent on goods and services, right? So the speed at which money is changing hands per year. Now, equation 1 here is an identity, and it defines the velocity of money as the ratio of nominal GDP to the money supply. So, well, we can get a little bit further into that in a minute. Now, the quantity equation, right, can be thought of as a like theory of money demand where we make a couple of assumptions about the velocity of money. So what I did here is I just took equation 1 and I divided both sides of that equation by the velocity. So now I've got the nominal money stock, MT, being equal to the inverse of the velocity of money times nominal GDP. There are a number of different schools of macroeconomic thought that are useful and worth listening to. There are many that are not, but one of the schools that is worth listening to is the monetarist school. Check it out if you ever get some free time on your hands. This particular school of thought argued that velocity could be determined by payment technology, right? Credit cards, ATMs, all that, and would be relatively close to constant, right? It may not be exactly constant, but close enough, right? It's low frequency because the number of transactions that are occurring using ATMs and credit cards last year are probably going to be pretty close to what they are this year, right? Now, given 2022, the economy is a little bit more open. 2021, it wasn't quite yet, so maybe, those years aren't that comparable. But we could look at, say, 2019 and 2018, and they probably wouldn't be all that different. So in that case, at least, via short-run fluctuations, it's not really all that time variant, right? So we could think of it as like time invariant. So let's just go ahead and replace the inverse of the velocity of money with this little variable kappa. Now, we're going to be treating kappa as constant. So if you look at kappa, there's no t subscript. So if there's no t subscript on one of these variables, we automatically assume it is time invariant. So it's not changing over time. There aren't different values for it over time. Now, we're going to be denoting money demand as this little m like subscript t with a superscript of d for money demand. We're going to let that equal the money supply. And when we do that, our money demand function is this. MD equals kappa times nominal GDP. So money demand is proportional to nominal income, right? And what's determining that proportion is the inverse of the velocity of money. And we are assuming here that K doesn't depend on things like interest rates. Now, the terms velocity and money demand are sometimes used interchangeably. Just want to kind of get that out of the way right now. But we can rewrite this thing in terms of real money balances by dividing both sides of, I know it says 3 here. It's actually equation 3, not just 3. There's just one side of 3. It's just 3, right? But if we go back to equation 3 here, right, MD equals kappa times P times Y, if we divide that guy by the price level, what we get is real money balances, M over P, equals 1 over V times Y. Thus, the demand for real money balances is proportional to the real quantity of exchange. Now, I'm sure if you go back to your principles of microeconomics, they talk a lot about things that shift your demand, right? So you get things that will move you to a new point on the existing demand curve, right? You're changing quantity demanded. But then there are things that shift demand, right? Well, one of the things here that's shifting demand is the inverse of the money velocity, or kappa. If the velocity for money goes down, the demand for money goes up. Now, the quantity theory of money assumes that money velocity is roughly constant, which is going to therefore imply that the demand for money is generally stable, right? If we're using velocity and money demand interchangeably, if the velocity of money is constant, the demand for money is generally constant, right? You can think of it as stable over time. And, we can probably talk about how accurate this is a little bit later, but for now, we can sort of just make this assumption and then just move right along. So let's look at a graph of the demand for money against the supply of money. So we've got price and nominal money balance space. When we plot out the demand for money, we get an upward sloping money demand curve. And you're probably looking at this going like, Jeremy, what in God's name are you showing me? I always learned that demand was downward sloping, because as the price level goes up, right, you're going to want less of that good because, well, you can purchase less of that good. And I would go, yes, you are in fact correct. However, we need to think about this in terms of money, not goods, right? Not goods that we can purchase, but goods we can purchase with money. So, okay, maybe that doesn't help explain why this thing is upward sloping in nominal money balances. So let's think about it instead of this class has its own little economy, right? So all 30, 40 of you that are in this class, there's this little microcosm in which you exist, and you have your own little small closed economy in there, right? You're all producing stuff and you're selling stuff to other people that are also producing stuff and selling stuff, and you're using money in order to facilitate these exchanges. So with money facilitating these exchanges, right, there's some money supply, right? Let's go ahead and denote that with that vertical money supply that we have here, meaning that there is a fixed supply of money and it is independent of the price level. Now, that money supply within your little microcosm is fixed, right? The nominal supply of money is going to be fixed here. Let's say I come in with a helicopter and I've got a bunch of cash and I do a helicopter drop of money into your little microcosm, into your little economy here, right? Let's say I double the money supply. But I'm not going to be changing output. I'm not going to be changing unemployment. I'm not going to be changing the capital stock. No real variables are going to be changing, right? So if no real economic variables move, but I just doubled the money supply, what's going to happen? Well, I'm going to be doubling the price level. Maybe not doubling, but I'll be increasing the price level. No, actually, I will be doubling the price level. Oops. Anyways, I'll double the price level if I double the money supply. So all of a sudden, right, that $100 is now really only worth $50. So you're going to want more nominal money balances in order to be able to have the same. You're losing real purchasing power. So you're going to want more money. So there will be a higher quantity demanded of money when it comes to an increase in the price level. So here we have an equilibrium of money demand and money supply. And that equilibrium is going to yield a price level of P0. If I were to increase the money supply, like I said, a little helicopter drop of money, increase that money supply, what happens? Well, the money supply shifts out. We shift along the upward sloping money demand curve. The price level increases. And as the price level increases, well, the quantity of money demanded is going to increase. Now, let's say instead of adjusting the money supply and moving that, let's instead decrease the velocity of money or increase kappa, right? In that event, what's happening here? Well, the money demand curve is going to be shifting out, right? But it doesn't really shift, it pivots because it begins at the origin. And so when there is something that shifts demand here, it's going to be pivoting along, or it's going to be pivoting with that pivot point being the origin. So it pivots out and the price level is going to fall. There's an increase in income, right? Output goes up. Well, again, it's going to increase the demand for money, so the money demand curve is going to shift out. So here, what's going on? Well, income increases, right? Because we're producing more stuff. If we produce more stuff, then our income, right, is going to be increasing. So income goes up, but the supply of money doesn't change. So you can produce more goods, you're earning more money, but there's no change to the supply of money. What happens? Well, the real purchasing power of the money that you're holding is going to be increasing, meaning the price level is going to fall. So as incomes increase, right, your purchasing power goes up, given that, the supply for money remains constant. Price level falls, and there is thus an increase in the demand for money. Now, before I go any further on this, I do want to say that we will also be looking at the demand for money when it comes to interest rates and then the quantity of money. So in that case, you have a little bit more of a conventional demand curve that you're used to seeing where there's a downward sloping money demand curve. However, when it comes to money and price space, you have this upward sloping money demand curve. So once we look at that in the next lecture, you see that nice downward sloping thing, you're going to be like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm used to seeing that. This is more along the lines of what I recognize here. So anyways, with money and prices here, to kind of relate the two, right? So if we were to change the money supply and how the price level moves according to the quantity theory of money, let's take the quantity theory or the equation of exchange. Let's take that and instead of it being multiplicative, let's make it additive instead. So we take the natural log of it, and it gives us this. So we get the log of money plus the log of the velocity of money equals the log of the price level plus the log of output or income. And if the velocity of money is constant, as we've been assuming throughout the course of this lecture thus far, and output or income is exogenous with respect to the nominal stock of money, which thus implies that money is neutral and the classical dichotomy holds, we get this, right? ln(v) and ln(y) drop out of equation 5 to give us equation 6, in which the natural log of money is equal to the natural log of the price level. Now, if we want to take changes in these two guys, right, what we would get, right, if we take the derivative of them, we get the derivative of the natural log of money equals the derivative of the natural log of the price level. It's going to tell us that a change in the money supply results in a proportional change in the price level. So if the money supply were to increase by 5%, the price level also increases by 5%. So if we go back to that little microcosm, that little economy I was talking about with you guys, and I did my little helicopter drop, if I increased the money supply by 5%, by equation 8, what that's telling me is that the price level should also be increasing by 5%. because there's just more money, but there's no additional output. There are no changes in any real variables. So if real variables aren't changing, only nominal variables change. So prices will go up. You increase money, you increase prices. And so, again, this implying that monetary neutrality holds, a one-time change in the money supply or the growth rate of money isn't going to be affecting real economic variables in the long run. And equation 8 tells us just that, right? That equation 8 is essentially just the definition of monetary neutrality. Thus, the only variables that will respond in the long run are nominal variables like the price level and nominal interest rate, etc. Now, when it comes to money and inflation, we're actually going to have a full lecture on this topic alone. However, since the quantity theory of money, right, this equation of exchange, we're assuming for a minute that it holds across all time periods, because by this theory, right, by this theoretical framework, it does. What we can do is we can difference it across time. And by differencing a time series, right, or differencing this like macroeconomic variable, what I'm doing is I'm taking the previous value and I'm subtracting that from the current value. So if I were to take GDP of 2021, subtract that from GDP of 2022, right, I have differenced GDP. Now, the first difference of the natural log of any economic variable is the growth rate. So really, inflation is the growth rate of the price level, right? It's the rate of change of the price level over time. So if the natural log of PT minus the natural log of PT minus 1 is equal to inflation, what happens when we have a constant velocity? All right, if an economic variable is constant over time, if it's time invariant and you difference it, well, you're going to just get 0. So with a constant velocity of money, the log of VT is equal to the log of VT minus 1. So you subtract log of VT minus 1 from log of VT, that just gives you 0. So that drops out of equation 9. And instead, we get this little equation here that inflation is equal to the difference of the growth rate in money and the growth rate of output. So let's say if you were to increase the growth rate of money by 10%, and we will relax the assumption of monetary neutrality for just a moment and assume that the growth rate of output is 2%. Well, in that event, if the growth rate of money is 10%, growth rate of output is 2%, inflation has to be 8%. However, in the event of monetary neutrality, right, we unrelax that assumption again. The growth rate of output is equal to 0, so the inflation rate would be equal to the growth rate of money. So if output growth is independent of the money supply, right, inflation and money growth should be perfectly correlated, because essentially in that last little equation there, pi is equal to G superscript M, right? Inflation is equal to the growth rate of money. So you should have a pretty tight correlation there. But if we were to take, say, M2, which is a typically used measure of the money supply, and plot that against, say, the GDP deflator, which is a nice measure of inflation, we should have a pretty tight correlation here. And we do up until the point that we don't. Now, I took these two guys and I indexed them so that the first quarter of 1990 is equal to 100. So I can kind of plot the two of them together, and you can sort of see what's going on without, M2 being expressed in trillions of dollars, and then the GDP deflator, we're not going to worry about that, right? We can just plot them together and see what's going on here, right? Well, they're moving together for the most part, but we see around the 1990s, actually, M2 kind of starts increasing somewhat substantially, and the GDP deflator is more or less following just a nice constant, long-run trend here. So, like I said, they were correlated up until the point that they weren't. Now, let's talk about nominal and real interest rates here for a minute. The nominal interest rate tells you what percentage of your nominal principal that you get back, or that you have to pay back when you borrow it, in exchange for saving your money. right? And we're going to denote it with a capital RT, right? Any variable that's capitalized is going to be a nominal economic variable. Anything that's lowercase is a real economic variable. Now, in reality, there's a lot of different interest rates, and they vary depending on the maturity of the interest or of the asset. They vary depending on risk. But here, we're just going to be using a 2-period and a 0-risk interest rate. The time periods that we're going to be playing with are T and T plus 1. So if we're going quarterly, right, it's this quarter and next quarter. If we're going monthly, it's August and September. If we're going annually, it's 2022 and 2023, and that's it, right? Whatever the frequency of this time is, it just lasts for 2 periods, and that's it. So if you were to lend somebody money at, say, just make it annual here for a minute, you're to lend somebody money 1 year from today, you get your principal back plus the nominal interest rate. So if it's 5% and you lent out $100, a year from today, you get $100 back plus 5% on that. But the real interest rate, however, tells you something a little different. It tells you what percentage of a good you get back or have to pay back when borrowed in exchange for saving a good. And we're going to denote it with a lowercase r. So the nominal interest rate you can think of in terms of your money, right? If I lend you $100, how much money am I going to get back? The real interest rate is more goods, right? $100 can buy me a good, right? If I lend you that $100, how much of that good can I buy next year? So if I were to put one good in the bank, right, I'm putting what its monetary value is, we'll call it PT here, in the bank too, which means I'm going to get 1 plus the nominal rate, right? The reason you see that 1 plus R is if you put in $100, you're going to get 1 plus R times $100 tomorrow or next year, whenever the frequency of this time thing is, right? So 1 plus R times 100, it's 100 plus R times 100. So if R is, say, 5%, you get $105 back. So if you get 1 plus R times PT dollars tomorrow, we can purchase 1 plus R times PT divided by PT plus 1. So I'm dividing by the price level to control for variations in the price level over time. So if I put a good in the bank tomorrow, what I can buy is 1 plus R times PT over PT plus 1 goods tomorrow. So the real interest rate is adjusted for inflation, meaning it's not so much about how much money you're getting back as much as it is how much of a good you're getting back. So if I put $1 in the bank today and I get $1.05 back tomorrow, but I control for inflation, it's more of, if an apple costs $1 today, how much of an apple can I buy tomorrow with that $1.05? So we've got real interest rates, we've got nominal interest rates here. But I've explained sort of how we can think of each one, right? You can think of nominal rates as like the money and real rates is like the goods. But is there a way to actually mathematically tie the two of those dudes together? Fortunately, there is, and it is what is known as the Fisher equation. Via the Fisher equation, we can establish a relationship between real and nominal interest rates. We can begin with equation 10 here, right? The 1 plus the real rate equals 1 plus the nominal rate times PT divided by PT plus 1. So, okay, maybe this isn't the most intuitive way to look at it. Great. The inverse of the ratio of prices across time is the expected gross inflation rate. So you're like, oh, great. What the hell does that mean? Well, it means I'm going to have the left side of equation 10 is going to be the same. That 1 plus R on the right-hand side of equation 10 is still going to be the same, right? But where I multiply 1 plus R times PT over PT plus 1, you can actually divide 1 plus R times PT plus 1 over PT. Well, PT plus 1 over PT is 1 plus the expected inflation rate. So this capital funny looking E thing of pi t plus 1 is the expectations operator being applied to tomorrow's inflation rate. So I'm taking the expectation of inflation between period t and period t plus 1. So if I take 1 plus the nominal rate and divide it by 1 plus the expected inflation rate, I'll be getting 1 plus the real interest rate. Now, we can sort of approximate this guy here to the real rate being equal to the nominal interest rate minus the expected inflation rate. So if you take the nominal rate and you subtract what expected inflation is, you're going to be getting the real interest rate that you can expect to earn on an asset that you purchased today that will be repaid tomorrow. Now, in the classical dichotomy, the real interest rate is independent of anything nominal. So what that means is that the nominal interest rate moves 1 for 1 with expected inflation, giving us equation 12, which really is just the same as equation 11. It's just we're assuming that the nominal interest rate isn't going to be moving around with anything nominal, right? The nominal interest rate does, but the real rate doesn't. So what's driving expected inflation here? Well, let's just assume for a minute, right, this sort of like adaptive expectations approach here, that expected inflation can be equal to realized inflation, in which case I get this nice little relationship here of the nominal rate being equal to the real rate plus the rate of inflation. So if you take the real rate and add inflation to it, you get the nominal interest rate. So if the real rate is 2%, inflation's 2%, the nominal interest rate is 4%. Okay, well, actually, that's not a bad way to think about it, honestly, and it kind of relates the two, and, you know, even if you're like it was with me when I was taking this course in undergrad, I had kind of a hard time getting my head around the real interest rate for a little bit. But then when I saw the mathematical relationship via the Fisher equation, I was like, oh, actually, okay, this makes a little bit of sense. And then from there, I was able to get an intuitive understanding of what the real interest rate meant. So it really makes us now ask, is there a tight relationship between inflation and nominal interest rates? Because if there is, right, we can go, hey, the classical dichotomy holds. Because if inflation and nominal interest rates have, say, a perfect correlation, right? It's like a one-to-one movement thing here. Then there's no room for real interest rates in describing the behavior of, say, the nominal interest rate, right? It would be determined via movements within inflation. So let's look at this. See, there's a little bit of like a positive correlation here. But, you know, it's not a perfect correlation. And by the way, we're looking at the 3-month Treasury bill yield to maturity against the rate of inflation for all these different years in the United States. So we can see the nominal interest rate, with a higher nominal interest rate, we can expect a higher rate of inflation. With lower nominal rates, there are lower rates of inflation. So there's this positive correlation going on here, but the correlation is 0.74. It's not 1. Now, it's high, right? It's more correlated than, say, a coin toss, right? You'd just be like, you know, well, kind of being dumb there, assuming correlation is, you know, proper, whatever. There is some correlation that we can predict, however, there's not much. Not enough, I'll say. It would be nice if we had more. So maybe the classical dichotomy doesn't hold all that well. We can get some useful information out of it, but there's more correlation that can be described than just the variation in inflation with the variation in the 3-month Treasury bill rate. So the quantity theory of money says that the classical dichotomy holds, but this guy right here doesn't really show us that. But on top of saying that, it also has some rather strong claims, right? There are other things that are implied from the quantity theory of money. First, that the level of the money supply and the price level are going to be closely linked. Thus, the growth rate of the money supply and inflation are going to be closely linked with each other. and that the inflation rate and the nominal rate are going to be closely linked with each other. Now, point 3 here isn't so much an implication of the quantity theory by itself. It more follows from the Fisher equation plus the classical dichotomy and the concept of monetary neutrality. But the quantity theory of money goes a bit further to say that the nominal interest rate is linked to money growth. But how good are these predictions? Well, the quantity theory gives us a nice theoretical framework for inflation and interest rates over the medium to long run, right? So we can kind of think of almost like in a perfect world. The quantity theory is giving us a nice idea. There's a nice framework. There's a nice backbone from which we can then move on and try to understand some of the economic concepts of, say, short to medium run rather than medium to long run. So it works well in the medium to long run, but not so much in the short run. And, there are some problems with the theory. Shorter term relationships between money growth and both inflation and nominal interest rates are fairly weak. The velocity of money isn't constant, and it's actually getting harder to predict, especially since the early 1980s. It had a nice little long-run trend up until the early 80s, and then it just kind of is I'm going to do whatever the hell I want, as you'll see, in a minute. First, we've got money growth and inflation. What's going on here? Well, if we look at short-run behavior, right, according to the quantity theory of money, right, an increase in the money supply should give me a proportional increase in inflation at that same point in time, but we're not getting that, are we? Right? Money growth goes almost as high as 15% in the early 70s, and inflation is actually quite low. Inflation goes up later, more towards the mid 70s, it goes up. Okay, it gets probably 2.5% or so, but then it drops down. But, okay, we see the money supply here drop down, or the growth rate of money drop down. Then it increases again, and then inflation goes up and up and up. Okay. But then money growth slows, and eventually inflation slows, but it's occurring a good bit after the changes in the growth rate of money. Okay, well, what's going on here in the 80s? Well, in the 80s, overall, it's got a downward trend, but there are periods where the money supply growth rate increases a little bit, but not really much movement in inflation here. Okay. Well, let's see what's going on in the 90s. Well, the growth rate of money actually drops a good bit through the early to mid 90s. Inflation's relatively stable. Begins to increase a little bit in the mid to late 90s. You get a little bit of variation in inflation here, but drops as the growth rate in money is really kind of increasing. Oh God. All right, well, let's look at this, 2008-ish. All right, the growth rate of money increases substantially, but whoa, what the hell is this? We get a drop in inflation? Now, inflation eventually goes back up after the increase, but as you can see, we've got periods of high money growth and low inflation. The quantity theory of money would not be suggesting that. The quantity theory of money would suggest high money growth, high inflation. Now, let's look at 2020. Well, the growth rate of money massively increased, and, well, the inflation rate eventually picked up, and it picked up much faster than what we see kind of going over here. And we can get into why that is a little bit later. But really, it has a lot to do with the shutdowns, and then as the economy tried to reopen, but there was a lot of super, super accommodative monetary policy as well as fiscal policy. When an economy wasn't really open, it was a lot like that helicopter drop I was talking to you guys about earlier. The price level is going to be increasing when output came responding. Okay, so money growth and inflation, there's a narrative that can be woven from this, but it's not as clear-cut as what the quantity theory of money would suggest. Great. Let's look at the velocity of M1 from 1959 over to 2022. Well, like I said, up until the early 80s, it's got a nice little predictable, kind of upward moving long-run trend. But then in the early to mid 80s, it's just just kind of goes all over the place. Now, we can see the velocity of money dropped substantially in 2020 when the pandemic hit. Okay, yeah, that actually makes sense. Shutdowns and stuff, fewer transactions. There's a cut in the velocity of money, at least of M1. Let's look at M2. Well, M2 actually has a good bit more variation in it. But, it's a broader measure of the money supply than M1, so it's really not all that surprising that you'd see that, right? You could honestly kind of make an argument that it's a little bit more predictable up until more like the mid 80s, getting closer to like 1990 or so, and then definitely in the 90s it's just not predictable at all. And again, you see a giant drop in the velocity of money in 2020, which again, like I said, is to be expected, right? That's not a particularly surprising fluctuation there. Let's look at money growth and interest rates. Excuse me for that burp there. So we've got the M2 growth rate and then the 3-month treasury yield. Plot these two guys together. Now we can see they're moving in like opposite directions, right? If treasury yield drops, right, you get an increase in the money supply. So they're kind of moving in like opposite directions here. Look at the 80s. Treasury yield goes up, money growth drops. Okay. So they're moving in opposite directions up until 2008. And then the treasury yield is just flat. It is at near zero. It's close to the zero lower bound for nominal interest rates, but the money growth rate is still all over the place. So what's going on here? Well, the Federal Reserve switched its policy instruments or its policy tools from looking at like short-term nominal interest rates over towards like long-term treasury securities. Okay, you're not going to get a whole lot of variation in the short-term treasury yield, especially when it's kind of stuck at zero. So they used other stuff to try to be able to have an effect on the money supply and then affect real economic behavior that way. So we'll get into the financial crisis as well as the pandemic responses, which really the Federal Reserve's responses to each were pretty identical, which is rather stupid if you ask me. But I won't go too far into that now. But you get some pretty wide fluctuations in the growth rate of M2, with the 3-month treasury yield being at zero, essentially. So again, this wouldn't necessarily be implied by the quantity theory of money. So there are some shortcomings in the quantity theory of money. So in the next lecture, we're going to try to come up with a way to fill in some of the gaps that the quantity theory of money has left us with, right? Because the quantity theory of money can explain a good bit, but it can't explain maybe as much as we would like. So it's not a bad theory. It's not like a bad model. It just doesn't work all that great all the time. It works well for like medium to long run stuff. And it works well kind of just going like, well, here's a nice stylized fact, the conventional economic logic theory, what have you. But there are times where it breaks down. It doesn't work. We need to find a way to fill in those gaps. Now, remember, right, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. Very, very good thing to remember here. Just because the quantity theory of money doesn't work all the time doesn't mean that it doesn't work, and it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's useful, and it's, if nothing else, it gives us a nice framework for understanding of economic fluctuations. It's just not the best thing in the world. So in the next lecture, we're going to be covering money demand in terms of the liquidity preference of money rather than the quantity theory of money. And you'll be seeing a function for the demand for money that's a little bit more like what you're used to seeing with just demand for just stuff, right? But until then, I will wrap the video up here. Thank you for watching, and be on the lookout for later this week, or more likely early next week. There will be another lecture coming out that is part 2 of the demand for money. So in the meantime, thank you for watching.